Now we're going to move on and talk about political participation. Political participation is ways in which we seek to influence government and politics. So, as a definition, political participation, actions of private citizens, that's you and I, not actions of governments, uh, actions of private citizens by which they seek to influence government and politics. There are two types of political participation. There is conventional behavior, which is relatively routine, institutional, and culturally acceptable political behavior. Basically, it's things that are normal, things that when you do them, people don't question them. And generally, by institutional, means that our political and social systems are set up to facilitate it and to help you do it. Uh, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. There's also unconventional behavior, relatively uncommon political behavior that challenges or defies established institutions and dominant norms. These are the things you do outside of the standard institutional political system. These are things you do that people do when the traditional avenues of political influence don't work anymore. Uh, and by definition, that means unconventional, not normal, not standard, different. Now, unconventional participation, it was much more common before the advent of democracy, and it's still relatively common in non-democratic countries because one of the points of unconventional participation or sit-ins, protests, boycotts, vandalism, violence, whatever you want, however you want to do it, one of the points of unconventional participation is to make known issues that are generally ignored by the existing government and the existing political system. If the existing political system and the structure does not address the problems of a fairly large group of people, then those people will turn to protest. And right now in our society, the electoral process is the mechanism for showing your displeasure. But if the electoral process does not work, much like in the civil rights movement, which is probably the one of the great successful unconventional participation events in our history, if the existing political order does not address the issues, then you must turn to other means, which include protests. But in general, in the United States, violence is not very common in protests. In other countries, violence is more common, but in the United States, when people do protest, it's generally nonviolent. There may be threats of violence, but it's generally nonviolent. Now, what happens when you have an individual protest, or maybe a couple of isolated protests, and it spreads and it expands, region wide, statewide, even nationwide, potentially worldwide? If you have an active and sustained effort to achieve social and political change, meaning an active and sustained effort to upset or challenge the political order or challenge the existing political norms, uh, that's called a social movement. It's basically protests that organically grow into a life of their own and last for years or decades. And as I mentioned before, the civil rights movement is probably the best example of a basic protest that turned into a social movement. The modern civil rights movement began with a simple protest of Rosa Parks not getting out of her, not moving to the back of the bus, which the law stated she was supposed to make room for a white rider. And that was a protest. That was unconventional political participation. She was challenging the existing laws, and then it over time turned into the civil rights movement, a social movement that was active and sustained. Now, when it comes to unconventional participation or protests, in the United States specifically, there is a difference between our theoretical support for these types of actions and our actual support. Theoretically, we embrace unconventional participation and protest. If you think about it, when we learn our history, much of our history, the founding of America, is based in unconventional participation or protests against the British government. Things like the Boston Tea Party, the Revolution, uh, you know, the Sons of Liberty and their protests. All of these things are examples of unconventional participation, and when we read about them in history, in general, they're seen as a positive thing because we're challenging a an existing order or a government that is not fair or is oppressing us. But in all actuality, when we see somebody protesting, and if it's not something that we have a vested stake in, if they're not protesting something that we agree with them about, then we generally dislike it and we reject it. And if somebody is marching and blocking traffic or blocking a walkway, and they're protesting for an issue that we or you don't agree with, well, you're going to be mad at them. You're going to say, why don't you go home, you loser? Or, why are you bothering me? Why are you, what's your point? And uh, and so generally we don't embrace unconventional protests or unconventional participation unless we actually consciously agree with the purpose of the protest. And effectiveness varies in the protests. In general, though, this is the one thing you need to take out of this. You will not have effective unconventional participation because the whole point of unconventional participation in protest is to get mainstream America to recognize the injustice, to get the average person to see that you're right. And the one thing that will prevent that from happening more than anything is violence. So if you want your uh, your protest, your sit-in, your boycott to work, you can never use violence. You must use uh, peaceful types of protest because history has shown that that is more likely to work.
First, let's talk about conventional participation. There are two types of conventional participation. There is supportive behavior and influencing behavior. Supportive behavior and influencing behavior. Supportive behavior, they're actions that express allegiance to country or government, meaning you support your country. You're not really doing anything actively to try to change policy. You're not trying to lower taxes, or you're not trying to, you know, have government, uh, declare war on somebody. You're simply showing actions that express allegiance to country or government. Some of the most common things that we do are saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Um, you learn that as a small child in the kindergarten. The first thing you learn how to do is say the pledge every morning. Uh, you know, it's symbolic, but it's supportive. It's showing your support for the country. Also, flying the American flag on your car in front of your house, putting an American flag sticker somewhere. That's just supportive behavior. Now, the question becomes, though, is showing displeasure, can that be considered a supportive behavior? If you are displeased with your country, uh, are you supporting it by letting people know that? That's a question we all struggle with. Me personally, I believe that showing displeasure or making it known that you are displeased in general with your nation is showing support because you want to change it for the better. Your goal is to make your country better, and that is supportive. One of the great quotes that I really love is by Mark Twain, and he says this, and let's think about this for a minute. Patriotism is supporting your country all the time and your government when it deserves it. And what he's doing here, he's making drawing a line and a difference between your country and your government. Your country is the geographic area in which you live. Your country are the people and the institutions within that country. Your government is basically the people who you elect and the people who are making policy and implementing policy. So if you're patriotic, you support your country all of the time and your government when it deserves it. The people make so you support America all the time, and you support the people making the decisions only when they deserve it. And when they don't deserve it, it is okay. It is supportive to protest against your existing government institutions and government leaders, because in doing so, according to Mark Twain at least, you'd be supporting your country. Now, there's also influencing behavior. influencing behavior are actions that attempt to modify or maintain policies or leaders. Basically, these are actions you take to try to change government policy, okay, to try to alter the way things are, or possibly keep things the way they are by your actions, your votes, whatever. Generally, our influencing behavior, we partake in influencing behavior to get particular individual benefits. We want personal gain. It's very unlikely that we are going to spend time or money to try to influence policy if we are not going to gain from it in some way. People don't tend to waste their time on things where they get no benefit. So, especially in politics and charity, things like that, uh, that's different. But in politics, usually our interactions with regard to influencing behavior, our interactions with local officials. Rarely do we ever come into contact or speak to or need to talk to national government officials or even state level government officials. Usually, any interactions we have, any influencing behavior, any attempts to alter the way things are done immediately is done at the local level. If there's a big pothole in front of my yard, in front of my house, I'm going to call the city of Livingston or wherever you're at, Lufkin, to come fix it. That's influencing behavior. You're maintaining. You're trying to get them to enforce policies of maintaining roads. Uh, if you're upset that the local government's not properly keeping up the local park, you call them and you complain. Well, that's influencing behavior. Uh, Working for a neighbor who's running for city council, or your uncle or brother that's running for school board, that's influencing behavior. Or some examples: organizing groups, PTOs, things like that. Candidate issue support, meaning putting a bumper sticker on your car that says "Vote for Joe Smith" or "Save the whales," whatever. That is influencing behavior. Volunteering for groups or for political campaigns, and probably besides voting, the most common influencing behavior in politics, as far as to trying to get candidates elected or influencing the election of candidates, is contributing money. A lot of people do that because oftentimes they don't have time to actually volunteer to help a candidate. So they will just donate money to a campaign. Now, voting is the most common supportive and influencing behavior. Obviously, it's an influencing behavior because your vote can determine whether a person wins an election or not, which can, in down the line, determine the policy. It's also a supportive behavior because if people vote, then it supports the institutions of democracy. It supports the principles on which the United States is founded, which is, you know, representative democracy. So it's supportive and influencing. The only problem is that we are terrible at it. As a nation, we are terrible at voting. Voter turnout. Voter turnout is the percentage of voting age population that actually vote. So the percentage of voting age, meaning 18 or over, that are qualified, they don't have some exemption or whatever, voting age citizens that actually vote. Regular voters are people who vote in every election. I consider myself a regular voter. I vote in the presidential elections. I vote in the national midterm elections. I try to vote in city elections, school board elections. Regular voters. About 40% of the population are considered regular voters. 40% regular voters. Then you have occasional voters. These people vote in the presidential election usually. They might vote in the midterm elections, midterm national elections, but not always. And they won't generally vote in the local elections unless it's a cause or an individual that they have some personal connection to. And that's about 25% of the voters. 25% of the voters are occasional voters. Then you have the rest of us. 35% of the population rarely or never vote. And most of them never vote. Rarely they might vote once. And but most of them never vote. And then so that's 35%. That's almost as many as the regular voters. And this frustrates me to no end because it's these people oftentimes that I'm around that complain the most about what government does, and they're the ones that don't participate in the process to try to actually influence the behavior of the politicians. And my daddy once told me that if you don't vote, you can't complain because if you vote, you can complain. If you participate, you have a right to make your voice heard. If you don't, then just you know keep your mouth shut. That's the attitude. Now, one of the problems with low voter turnout is that the fewer people you have voting, the fewer people determine policies. The fewer people that determine who makes our policies. So the implications of low voter turnout are this. Let's say for instance there's an election and all the regular voters vote and that's it. So you got 40% voter turnout. So let's say 40% of Texans vote for governor, vote for the state legislature. 40%. And let's say statewide it's a very close election. One party wins and the governor wins 51% to 49% as far as the number of people that actually voted. So you have 40% of everybody voting. And of those 40%, about a little over half vote for the winner. Okay? So half of 40% is 20%. So let's just say 21% of all regular voters actually voted for the winner. So 21% of the voting population are determining who is making policy for 100% of the population, if that makes any sense. So basically, if a little over half of 40% voted for the winner, then a little over half of 40% are determining who's making policy for everybody. And that's a problem. That means a very small handful of people are determining your life and the lives, and the issues and the economic and social issues that impact your life. It's a small handful of people for the most part. So the more people vote, the more likely you will get a consensus that what what the public wants is actually implemented into policy. Right now, what 21% of the population wants is actually implemented into policy. So why low voter turnout? Why don't people vote in the United States? Well, the number one reason given is too busy, other things to do. Oh, I was just too busy to vote. It happens once every, national elections at least, once every 2 years. Surely you can find time once every 2 years to take 30 minutes out of your day to go vote. It is a cop out excuse. It's a cop out excuse. And anyway, and the thing is, the people that vote the most, and we'll talk about this here in a minute, are older people, and of course, policy tends to benefit them the most. So who votes? Who votes? Um, Education. The more education you have, the more likely you are to vote statistically. So somebody with a high school diploma is more likely to vote than somebody that's a high school dropout. Somebody that has an associate's degree is more likely to vote statistically than somebody who just has a high school diploma. Somebody who has a bachelor's degree votes more than an associate's degree, and on up. So it's almost a direct correlation between education and voting. The more education, the more likely you are to vote. Income. The more money you make, the more likely you are to vote. Of course, income often ties in with education because, for the most part, statistics show that the more education you have, the more money you will make over a lifetime. So, the more money you make, the more likely you are to vote. Age. These also tie in with income because hopefully the older you get as you progress in your career, you'll make more money. But the older you get, the more likely you are to vote. Those 65 and older are the most likely to vote. Like 75% of people 65 and older, something like that, vote. Whereas people aged 18 to 25, only about 25% vote. So, anyway, gender. I'll catch you on this one. Women are more likely to vote than men. Women are more likely to vote than men. Race and ethnicity, whites are more likely to vote than all other ethnicities and races. Um, African Americans come in, I believe, second as far as those most likely to vote. And I've got a chart coming up here to kind of show show that. And then interest in politics. This is interesting because you can be uneducated, you can have a low income, you could be young, you could be a man, and you might not be in the racial or ethnic category that votes the most. But if you have a strong interest in politics, somebody's interest in politics can override any of those other demographic factors. So that's why you do have uh, some non traditional people that don't fall in the proper demographics that actually um, participate in politics and vote on a consistent basis. This graphic or table shows the average percentage of voting age population that voted in national elections between 1945 and 2005. So in that 50-year window, and I'm sure it extrapolates into uh, today, and it's probably going to be very similar statistics today as it is between 45 and '05. It lists the country and the percentage of people that, on the average percentage of people that vote. Italy, number one, 93% of voting age population in Italy vote in the national election. Well, let's go find the United States. Down, down, down. Australia, Germany, Romania, India, Switzerland, the United States. In this list, we are dead last. 48% on average of the voting age population, actually vote in national elections. Actually vote in national elections. That is just utterly, in my mind, pathetic. This is an interesting graphic. Percentage of registered voters by age, race, ethnicity, and gender. And this, while this only shows the percentage of registered voters, you can extrapolate this to determine who actually votes because it's going to be about the same differences. Because if you're registered to vote, you're more likely to vote. So age, 18 to 24 years old. Only 43% of those 18 to 24 years old are registered to vote. And for the most part, most of them, only half of those vote. So you're looking in the 20th percentile. 25 to 44, you have about 55% that are registered to vote. So, and then of course 45 to 64, you got 69% that are registered. So as you can see, as we said before, as you get older, you're much more likely to be registered to vote, and therefore you're much more likely to vote. Race and ethnicity, white whites 68% are registered to vote, blacks 62%, Asian Pacific Islanders 49%, and Hispanics 53%. So of course that category, by those statistics, those that are more likely to be, those that are registered to vote are more likely to vote. And then gender. Women, 68% of women are registered to vote, and 65% of men overall are registered to vote, meaning that women are more likely to vote than men. Now let's talk a little bit about party identification. Party identification. In America, the United States, generally there are two political parties that people commonly identify with, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. There are other political parties, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but for the most part, we are a Democratic Republican and Republican dominated political system in, in a two party system. Party identification, which party you identify with, whether you're Republican or a Democrat, is the most powerful predictor of voting behavior. That makes perfect sense. If you call yourself a Republican, you're much more likely to vote for a Republican candidate. If you call yourself a Democrat, you're much more likely to vote for a Democratic candidate. Um, One of the things that has become a little more common, at least among more independent-minded voters, even though they may identify with one party or another, is ticket splitting. You go down and you research, first of all, before the election, you research the different candidates of both parties to determine, how their policies fit with your own political values, your own political beliefs. And then you just go down and you split your ticket. You vote for some Republicans, you vote for some Democrats, you maybe vote for an independent, maybe a Libertarian or a Green Party candidate, and you just split the ticket. Um, Other ties with political party, ideology and party. In America, the more conservative you are, the more likely you are to be a member of the Republican Party. The more liberal you are, the more likely you are to be a member of the Democratic Party. And liberal and conservative, those things are just kind of ways you view the role of government and how government interacts in your life. And we'll talk more about that later in the semester. But ideology has a strong tie with party identification. Race and ethnicity. Um, Whites tend to much more identify with the Republican Party, and all other races identify are more likely to identify with the Democratic Party. And that goes back to some historical uh, uh, interactions with the parties. The Democratic Party under Lyndon Johnson was the party that pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that made it illegal, basically illegal to discriminate. So uh, that type of connection with the party for racial minorities creates loyalty, and they remember that type of thing. Gender, women are more likely to be Democratic, men are more likely to be Republican. Income, the more money you make, the more likely you are to be a Republican. And issues. Some people choose party based on issues. Others choose party based on tradition. Yeah, their parents were Republicans or Democrats, so they are Republicans or Democrats. But oftentimes it's issues. If there's an issue that's important to you, that impacts you personally, you will look at the different candidates, and they may or may not be issues that are important to the political parties, but you will vote based on the issues. There's also one other identifying characteristic when it comes to voting, and that's retrospective voting versus prospective voting. And this is where you go to the ballot box and you're deciding to vote for a candidate or party, and you can do it retrospectively, meaning what you'll do, retro means in the past, retro means old. So what you would do is you would look at what that person has done in the past, what their track record is, or what the party has done in the past, and vote based on that. Retrospective voting. Or you would base your vote on prospective voting. What are the prospects? What are the future? And you would base your vote on what this person is telling you they're going to do in the future, what the party plans to do in the future, what new things do they have planned to solve the problems. So that's prospective voting. And you can vote either prospective or retrospective. And what generally happens is people use a combination of the two. They will weigh what a candidate has done in the past, and also think about what the candidate is talking about he will do in the future, he or she will do in the future, and compare the different candidates and vote based on that.